Well, hello again, everybody. My name is Aaron Bracy, and I'm very happy to be joined today by best-selling author John Feinstein. John, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Aaron. Good to talk to you.
John, if you're listening to this YouTube channel video, you can also download our podcast on Bracy Sports Media. If you're listening to our podcast, you can also watch on our YouTube channel. John is the author of 42 books, including Season on the Brink and A Good Walk Spoiled. His most recent book, The Back Roads to March, was published last month. You can also find out more about John and his books on his website, jfeinsteinbooks.com. John, let's get right into it. If I say this to you, what feeling does this evoke? To win the game is great, to play the game is greater, but to love the game is greatest of all.
Well, the first image that comes to my mind, Aaron, is me standing in front of that sign on the concourse at the Palestra, which I always do whenever I go to a game there. There's no place I enjoy going to a sporting event more than the Palestra. It is everything that college basketball should be. Penn plays their home games there. Big Five games are played there. It opened in 1927. It seats 87-22. There's not a bad seat in the house. That sign is right there on the concourse to see and read and smile about whenever you go there. My wife has said for many years that if I ever disappear, she'll send the police to look for me at the Palestra because she'll figure I've moved in there.
One of the things that you do, John, whenever you go to the Palestra is you buy 3 pretzels. And these 3 pretzels are for, the other one is for yourself, and the other 2 are for some important people that you dedicated the book to. Can you explain that to our listeners?
Yeah, sure. The book's dedicated to Jack Sawyer and Dick Hoops Weiss, who have been friends and mentors of mine for more years than I care to imagine. Jack was the AP sports reporter in Philadelphia for 45 years, and probably just as important, he organized the Wednesday noon hoops game for the media. For at least that long. And as a result, Jack has a key to the back door of the Palestra, which to me is one of the great honors you can ever have. And he tells a story about a snowy night when he pulled his car up to the back door and started to walk in. And a security guard said, "Buddy, you can't go in there." And he said, "No, it's okay." And he said, "Buddy, the door's locked." And Jack said, "I know, I have a key." And he opened the door and walked inside. And Dick Hoops Weiss is been a mentor of mine since I was in college. He worked at the Philadelphia Daily News, the New York Daily News. He got his nickname because his life is hoops, to be honest. He knows every player who ever played. If you bring up a player, the first thing he'll say is, "Oh, I've known him since he was a kid." And in many, if not most cases, it's true. And when I go to a game at the Palestra, I sit between Jack and hoops. And there's no better place in the world for me to be than sitting there between the two of them. And I dedicated the book to them.
One of the cool things about Jack, and I told you this, is you reading your books have helped me become a better writer. And working alongside Jack covering games has helped me become a better man. And I'm just wondering if you could just address Jack as a person. And also I wanted to ask you, because he's an all-time trivia person, and I never get his trivia questions correct, but he has one of the best trivia questions ever.
Jack does? Or
yeah. Who is the all-time leading scorer in Palestra history?
And it is Jack because of all those years playing in those noon games. By far, I don't think anybody's even close to him. They actually Jack was a great shooter. I don't know if you ever played with him.
I have. I played in those Wednesday games.
And at his, I think it was his 70th, but it might have been his 80th birthday party, which was held on the floor of the Palestra. They asked him to shoot free throws, and he made 30 in a row.
Wow!
And that's how good a shooter. Fran Dunphy tells a story, the old Penn and Temple coach, one of the great men in Philadelphia, also, that one day during a Christmas break, he planned practice for 1:00 when he was coaching at Penn, and walked in the gym with his players, and the noon hoops game was still going on, and Jack looked at Fran and said, "Dump, what are you kidding me?" And Fran said, "We'll spend some time looking at tape. You take all the time you need, Jack," because he wouldn't dare try to throw Jack off the court.
What a great story. Oh, sorry, John.
Sorry, but you asked about Jack as a man, and you know him as a man, obviously. To me, the people who I admire the most are very accomplished people who don't have to tell you how accomplished they are. And you'll never hear Jack talk about all the people he wrote about, all the people he's known, all that he accomplished as a reporter and as a dad. He's so proud of his kids and his grandkids. You have to ask him. You have to draw it out of him. And I've always tried to be that way. I probably fail a lot, but that's why I refer to Jack and Hoops as mentors, not just friends.
John Feinstein joining us here on Bracy Sports Media. John, as you tell that story about Jack, it's one of the things that makes your book so great is you are such a great storyteller and really humanize stories. And I read that one of the things that you learned about was when you were interviewing Mets manager Jeff Torborg, and there was a trade, and he told you, you asked him if it was a big trade, and he said, well, to the guys who are being traded, it is. I'm wondering if you could just expand on that and tell us how that helped you even humanize more your stories in your books.
Well, I've always had a sense that you don't have to be rich and famous to have a great story to tell. You don't have to be a diaper dandy. You don't have to be Tiger Woods or Bob Knight or Mike Krzyzewski. I've written about all those people, and I know people want to know about them. But the stories I enjoy doing the most are about people who aren't making headlines every day, who maybe you've never heard of, in fact. And I got some of that initially working as the night police reporter when Bob Woodward was the Metro editor at the Post. He was the first person who taught me that lesson. But as you mentioned, in 1991, I was at the winter meetings, baseball winter meetings. Jeff Torborg had just been named manager of the Mets. And at the winter meetings, they'll announce press conferences to say we've made a trade, and everybody comes running. And I was walking out of lunch one day, and I heard an announcement that the Mets were having a 2:00 press conference to announce a trade. There'd been all sorts of rumors that the Mets were about to make a trade to get Brett Saberhagen, who at the time was a superstar. And they did eventually trade to get Saberhagen. But I happened to run into Torborg at that moment. And I said, so is this the big trade? And Jeff said, for the guys who are being traded, yes, it is. And that stuck with me because it made me realize that all the agate we read in the paper, transactions, a little tiny type, one sentence here, one sentence there, for the guys whose name appear in that type, it is the big trade. It's life-changing. They've been cut, they've been traded, they've been called up from the minor leagues, whatever it might be. It's a big deal for those guys, and there's always a backstory. And I did a book several years ago called Where Nobody Knows Your Name, which was about AAA baseball. And
I've read that book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you liked it.
I loved it.
And that book was about guys who appear in the agate. And they might appear in the agate 7 or 8 times a year, going up, down, released, signed by another club. There was one guy I wrote about who actually was in 5 different organizations, baseball organizations, in a period of 21 days. He was traded, he was cut, he was picked up, he was released again. And that book got great reviews, was a bestseller, and again, reminded me that you don't have to be a star. And The Back Roads to March is very much like that, because it's not about anybody who's going to be a lottery pick. It's not about anybody who's going to be a one and done. It's not about any of the superstar coaches who, as I said, I know well, whether it's Krzyzewski or Bill Self or Roy Williams or anybody else you might care to name. It's about guys who fly under the radar. But they love basketball just as much as the superstars. And in many cases, I believe they have much better, more interesting stories to tell. Let me put it that way.
And in fact, it's about going to places where you don't even know exist. And in fact, it almost got you in trouble with your wife on one of your trips.
It did. One of the places I went was to Longwood University. The coach there is a guy named Griff Aldridge, who to me personifies in many ways what the book is about and what I just said about not having to be rich and famous to have a story to tell. Although Griff's kind of rich because he played Division III basketball, went to Virginia Law School, wanted to coach, but had $110,000 in school loans to pay back. So he went to work for a law firm in Houston, was hugely successful, became a partner, was making $800,000 a year, but 20 years later still had that coaching itch because he loved basketball so much. And when Ryan Odom, who'd been his college roommate at Hampton-Sydney, got the job at UMBC, he called Ryan and said, I'd still kind of like to coach. And Ryan said, well, I can hire you and pay you $32,000 a year. So he took a $770,000 a year pay cut, moved his family from Houston to Baltimore. And as you know, 2 years later, UMBC upsets Virginia, first 16 seed to ever win an NCAA tournament game. And the president of Longwood noticed, because Griff's name was kind of in the back of his mind since they'd both gone to UVA Law School at almost the same time. So he called Griff, hired him to be the coach at Longwood. And I went down to spend a day with him when they were getting ready to play High Point now coached by Tubby Smith, who is rich and famous, having won a national championship at Kentucky. And during the game, I was sitting there watching, and my wife texted me and said, I forget where you are. What time will you be home tonight? So I texted back. I said, I'm in Farmville, Virginia. I'll be home about midnight. Text came flying back. You're having an affair. There's no such place as Farmville, Virginia. And so the title of that chapter is, Yes, Christine, There Is a Farmville. And by the way, Longwood won that night.
And this is why you have to read John Feinstein's books. Great stories like this. John, writing is not an easy thing to do. What appeals to you about writing books? And I'm wondering if you could take us through the actual process of writing your books.
Well, first of all, when I started at the Washington Post, my biggest problem in dealing with editors, I had many, I still do, was that I always thought I needed more space. The story that kind of sums up my relationship with editors was I was covering a Davis Cup final, and John McEnroe and Jose Luis Clerc were playing the last match to decide the Davis Cup. Great match, 5 sets. I called into the desk, and an editor named George Minot, really good guy, answered. And I said, how much space do I have? He said, 24 inches, which was fairly standard. And I said, George, you don't understand. This match was incredible. This is I need at least 40 inches. He said, that's fine. Go ahead and write 40. We'll use the best 24. And that sums up my newspaper career even now. And one of the things I love about books is you can get deep into a subject. You have time, you have flexibility, you can develop trust with the people you're writing about. If one day is bad for somebody, you can do it another day. When I was doing my first golf book, A Good Walk Spoiled, there were a number of days when I'd walk with a player because I was supposed to talk to him afterwards, and he'd have a bad round. And so I'd say, look, if you don't feel like it, we don't have to talk today. One day I walked with Curtis Strange, and he was 2 under par through 16 holes. It was at the Memorial Tournament, solid first day. Then he double bogeyed 17 and 18. And he came off the course, steam coming out of his ears, and just stalked right past me like I wasn't there. So I'm figuring dinner that night is off, but I had to be sure. So I waited till he finished hitting balls on the range. He walks off the range and again, walks right past me. So I turned around and I said, so Curtis, should I assume that dinner's off tonight? And he turned around and he said, what was your first goddamn clue? And I said, the first goddamn double bogey. And he started to laugh. And he said, I'll meet you at 7 o'clock.
That's great.
But there were other days where I'd say to a guy, look, we can do this another day. And he'd say, oh, thank you. Thank you. That's the flexibility you get from writing books. And in terms of the process, I never start writing until I'm finished with my reporting, because I need to know what the ending is before I try to create a beginning. And I've always been a fast writer. It's my newspaper training. When I was younger, when I wrote A Season on the Brink, my first book, which I hate to admit was now 33 years ago, I was an afternoon writer, because at a newspaper, you write for a first edition deadline, at least in the old days, for 7 or 7:30. But so I would get up in the morning, work out if I was working out, read the papers, get something to eat, sit down, edit what I'd written the day before with a fresh eye, and then start to write, and write all afternoon. Now I usually start in the morning. Ever since I had children, which is a long time ago now, you get up earlier, and I have my best energy in the morning. So I try to do the bulk of my writing by lunchtime, and then I have the afternoon free to make phone calls or do whatever else I might have to do.
John Feinstein joining us here on Bracy Sports Media. John, you mentioned Season on the Brink. You followed Indiana and Bobby Knight during the 1985-86 season, one of the best and best-selling sports books of all time. But maybe people don't know, you were actually rejected from 5 publishers from that book, and it kind of reminds me of Portland passing on Michael Jordan in the NBA draft.
I don't know if I compare it to that, but yeah, you're right.
Were you discouraged when that happened, or were you just confident that somebody would take on that book?
No, I was discouraged. I mean, I'd never written a book. Bob had, we'd had a meeting at the Final Four. I had suggested the idea. He said, well, if you can get a publisher, come on ahead. And what I remember most about that night, as I've written before, is Mike Krzyzewski was in the room because he was doing a clinic with Knight the next day, and they had to plan it. And as soon as we walked out of the room and the door closed, Mike looked at me and he said, are you out of your blanking mind? And I said, what are you talking about? He said, you're volunteering to spend a winter with him? Are you crazy? And I said, I've been around him. I know what it's like. He said, no, you don't. You've been around him for a couple days, never for a whole season. I said, well, you played for him. He said, yeah, I needed a place to go to college. You've been to college. I said, you worked for him. He said, I needed a job. You have a job. I said, well, I'm going to give it a shot anyway. And to jump ahead for a second, about a week after I got there, when the scene took place that became chapter 1, where he just destroyed Daryl Thomas, I called Mike and I said, okay, now I understand what you were talking about. I'm still glad I didn't listen to him. But what happened was I got an agent named Esther Newberg to take on the project. She was Dan Jenkins' agent. Sally Jenkins was one of my close friends. She suggested I call Esther, who actually hung up on me the first time I called. I introduced myself. She took the call. I introduced myself and told her what I wanted to do, that Bob Knight had agreed to give me access for an entire season. And she said, nobody cares about a basketball coach in the Midwest. Don't waste my time. Don't waste your time, and hung up. Wow. Sally then called her and yelled at her and said, this is a friend of mine. This guy's legit. You need to talk to him. So she called me back, apologized, and said, if you want to write a proposal, I'd be happy to read it. So I wrote a proposal, about 20 pages. And by then I was actually in France. I was at the French Open for the Post. And she called me in Paris and said, I think you've got a book here. If you'd like, I will try to sell it for you. I said, great. I had no idea what that meant. And 2 weeks later, by now I'm in London at Wimbledon, she calls again and says, I'm really sorry. I've taken this to 5 publishers who I would think would have been interested, and they've all turned it down. So I remember walking around London that night. It was a Friday night just before Wimbledon started, thinking, what do I do? I think I've got a good idea here. I think I've got a unique opportunity. I've never written a book, so I could be wrong. Should I just go ahead and spend the season and write the book and try to sell? Well, that's crazy, with no money at all, because I'd have to take a leave of absence. And I was baffled. I didn't know what to do. I was depressed. And 3 days later, Esther called and said that the 6th publisher she'd sent the book to, a guy named Jeff Newman at Macmillan, who'd been on vacation, had offered $15,000 as an advance, which meant taking a huge pay cut. Not huge, but a real pay cut from what I was making at the Washington Post, since I had to take a leave of absence. And I said, can you get me a little more than that? And she said, well, I'll try. And she called back and said, 17.5, take it or leave it. So I took it. And I guess the rest is history.
One of the real ironies about that book, and maybe another story people don't know, is your first basketball game as an 8-year-old was actually a game in which Bobby Knight was coaching. Yeah. Could you reflect on that story and the irony of how you two would be so intertwined?
Yeah, I had no idea at the time, of course, but the first college basketball game I ever saw was the consolation game of the 1965 NIT. In those days, all postseason tournaments had a third-place game, and Army was playing NYU. The championship game was between St. John's and Villanova. It was Joe Lapchick's last game as a coach. I had no idea how significant that was, but it was a Saturday afternoon, so my dad agreed to take me since it was an afternoon game. And I insisted that because there were 2 games that we get there by 11 o'clock, because if you're going to a game, you're going to see both games, right? And we got there were probably 500 people in the stands at Madison Square Garden when we arrived. But Army beat NYU. Tates Locke was coaching his last game because he had accepted the job at Miami of Ohio. And he had anointed as his successor 24-year-old Bob Knight. So Knight was sitting there on the Army bench. Of course, I had no idea who he was or what role he would ultimately play in my life, but it's kind of an ironic twist, as you said, that my very first college basketball game, Bob Knight was involved in.
I know our time is tight. I just wanted to ask you one more question. You probably get asked this a lot, but of all the books you've written and of all the people you've interviewed, is there one that really stands out to you as, I don't know, maybe necessarily your best book, but one that really stands out to you?
Well, there are two that stand out for entirely different reasons. One is the book I wrote on Bruce Edwards, who was Tom Watson's caddy for 30 years, who died of ALS.
Also a local guy and an Eagles fan.
A big Eagles fan, yeah, absolutely, and a big Phillies fan too. But Bruce was the first guy I ever interviewed on the PGA Tour. I was covering a tournament, the Memorial, in 1981. I'd been sent up by the Post just to look for feature stories because we were getting a tournament in Washington, the Kemper Open, for the first time that year. And the first day I got there, Tuesday afternoon, Bruce was sitting in the middle of the putting green late in the afternoon, smoking a cigarette. And I recognized him because he was the caddy for the #1 player in the world, Tom Watson. Walked over, introduced myself, sat down, and ended up spending 2 hours with him. Wow. And we became good friends. He was a great source. 22 years later, he was diagnosed with ALS. He asked me if I would write a book about his life as one of the first really professional caddies on tour, his relationship with Tom, and the battle he was going through. And I did the book. I got it done a week before he died. And it was literally a race with time to try to get it done and get it published because I wanted it to be in his hands. And right behind me, you can't see it, but I have a bookcase that has many of my books, and one of them in there is the book signed by Bruce a couple days before he died. So that was a very emotional experience for me, still emotional. Tom and I put on an annual tournament, charity tournament, to raise money for ALS research. So that book was unique. The one that I loved doing the most was a book called The Civil War. That was about the Army-Navy football rivalry. And I spent a season, again, it's an example of writing about guys who aren't going to be rich and famous. Right. But you'll never meet a better group of human beings than the 40 kids. They're not kids anymore. They're in their 40s. The book was 25 years ago, that I spent time with and got to know and wrote about in that book. And in fact, we were planning, the two captains, Jim Cantaloupe, the Army captain, and Andrew Thompson, the Navy captain, we were planning a 25th anniversary this coming December, for the two teams to get together because they're bonded by the book, really. Right. And Andrew and Jim are close friends. I'm still close with with them and many of their teammates. So it seemed like a great idea. Whether we'll be able to pull it off with what's going on now, I don't know, but I'd love to do it.
Well, John Feinstein joining us here on Bracy Sports Media. John, it has been a true honor and pleasure to have you on today. Really, I feel like I know you, even though I never really have talked to you before because I've read so many of your books. So thank you. Thank you for bringing a lot of joy into my life and to others' lives as well. And thank you for joining me here today on Bracy Sports Media.
Aaron, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Have a great day, everyone. If you like our videos, please subscribe and download our podcast, Bracy Sports Media, and have a great day. Thank you so much.